The sea was quiet that night in a way that felt impossible, almost unnatural. It was June 1944, but the wind carried something heavier than weather, something deeper than prediction. It carried expectation. It carried the pulse of history tightening, gathering, preparing to strike. For years, Britain had endured a war that felt like an endless shadow. Cities burned, families shattered. A nation stood alone longer than anyone believed it could. And then, slowly, steadily, the world began turning back toward the light. The Americans came. Factories roared back to life. Weapons crossed the Atlantic. Hope returned in steel and in flesh. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared the British commanders for what they were about to witness on the eve of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Not the drills, not the planning, not the maps, not the strategies etched across countless tables. Because nothing on paper could capture the real thing. Nothing could prepare the human heart for the sight of America's invasion. Fleet, thousands of ships stretching across the horizon like a steel continent, engines humming like thunder, lights glimmering like stars reborn on water. And for the British generals who stood on the shoreline, gazing at that impossible armada, what they saw was not just a fleet. It was a promise that after 5 years of darkness, the dawn was finally coming. The sky was still an ink-blue canvas when General Bernard Montgomery stepped out of his tent. His uniform was pressed, his beret settled at a familiar angle, but his eyes carried the weight of a commander who understood the cost of tomorrow. He carried a cup of tea in one hand, the steam curling into the cold morning air. He wasn't alone. Other British officers moved about quietly, whispering, checking messages, reading reports. But then a young communications officer hurried toward Montgomery, breath short. "Sir, it's begun. They're moving." Montgomery nodded slowly, almost solemnly, as though acknowledging the moment not as news, but as destiny. He walked toward the cliffside. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The moment wasn't going anywhere. If anything, it was waiting for him. When he reached the edge, he stopped. And then, almost without meaning to, he inhaled sharply. Because there it was. The American fleet, stretching so far across the horizon that it looked like the ocean itself had turned into machinery. Battleships, destroyers, landing craft, transports, carriers, supply vessels, escort ships, tugs, repair ships, medical ships, tank carriers, infantry carriers, artillery barges. A floating world. A world built for one purpose: liberate Europe or die trying. Montgomery stared for a long moment before whispering, "My God, they've brought everything." On a nearby ridge, General Sir Miles Dempsey stood with binoculars pressed to his face. He had seen American forces before. He had worked with their generals, studied their tactics, watched their factories turn out more equipment in a month than Britain could in a year. But this was beyond anything he'd imagined. He lowered the binoculars slowly, his hands slightly shaking, and muttered, "No army in history has ever gone to war like this." An aide beside him swallowed hard. "Sir, is it enough?" Dempsey didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted back to the endless formation of ships, lights flickering in the pre-dawn dark like constellations reflected in water. Finally, he said, "If this isn't enough, then nothing in this world ever will be." Farther down the coast, General Lee Mallory stood with his air commanders, their silhouettes sharp against the dim horizon. He wasn't looking at the sky, he was looking at the sea. And for a man who had spent his entire life studying air power, that alone said something. He whispered, "So this is what American industry looks like when it decides to win a war." A fellow officer replied under his breath, "It looks like the end of Hitler." The British generals didn't speak loudly. They didn't cheer. They didn't boast. There were no triumphant declarations, no speeches, no patriotic exclamations. Just awe. Just quiet, reverent awe. Because Britain had stood alone. Britain had fought when no one else could. Britain had bled to hold the line. But now the world was finally fighting beside them. And the United States had arrived not with hesitation, not with half measures, not with uncertainty. They had arrived with everything. The sea rumbled with the presence of machines. The ocean was alive with steel. The sheer scale of it was overpowering. British soldiers who had gathered along the cliffs, the docks, the sand dunes, and the observation posts were speechless. Some whispered prayers. Some wiped their eyes. Some simply stared as though They were witnessing a miracle they never thought they'd live to see. Because for years, endless years, the war had been a question. But now the answer was right there, floating on the channel. General Montgomery stepped closer to the cliff's edge. He felt the wind, tasted the salt, heard the low thunder of engines, and suddenly realized that he was watching something more than a military operation. He was watching the birth of the final chapter. He folded his arms behind his back and said quietly, as if speaking to history itself, "When future generations ask how Europe was saved, tell them it began here, when America filled the sea." As the light grew stronger, revealing more and more of the fleet, British officers gathered in small pockets along the coast, some in uniform, some still in nightcoats, some carrying notepads, others carrying radios. One officer whispered to another, "I knew the Americans were sending a lot of ships, but this is an armada." Another responded, "No, this is what happens when a nation decides it will not lose." A Royal Navy captain watching from a pier leaned on the railing and said with a stunned exhale, "This is the greatest sight the sea has ever held." By the time the sun finally broke the horizon, the entire invasion force was visible, miles and miles of metal. Men, weapons, engines, and will. The British generals didn't know whether to feel relief or sorrow, because they understood the truth. Some of the men on those ships wouldn't survive the next 24 hours. Some of the ships would never return. Some of the faces staring toward France would never see home again. And yet, those men were going anyway. Not for conquest, not for empire, not for glory, but for something far more powerful: to give a continent back its freedom. As the fleet churned eastward, Montgomery turned to a colonel beside him and said, "History will tell many stories of this war, but it will never forget the morning the Americans filled the sea." The colonel nodded, unable to speak. Montgomery continued, voice low but steady, "I have seen armies rise and fall. I have seen power shift from nation to nation. But I have never seen anything like this." He paused, then added, "This is not just an invasion. This is a declaration." And yet, there was more happening behind the scenes. British intelligence officers were watching the fleet's movements with precise attention. Royal Navy commanders charted every cluster of ships. British and American officers worked shoulder to shoulder, inside makeshift headquarters, analyzing the final details. But even they couldn't hide their emotions. One intelligence officer, normally calm and reserved, whispered, "This is what victory looks like before it happens." Another replied, "This is what hope looks like when it has teeth." The American fleet moved closer. The engines grew louder. The sea grew rougher, not from weather, but from motion. Waves crashed against hulls. Steel groaned. Men tightened straps, checked weapons, adjusted helmets. British observers could actually feel the vibration in the ground beneath their feet. That was how much machinery was moving. A British general shook his head slowly and whispered, "I knew the Americans were bringing force. But this is overwhelming." Another general beside him added, "It's more than overwhelming. It's decisive." Even seasoned British sailors, hardened by years of naval warfare, were astonished. One Royal Navy officer aboard a command ship muttered, "This is no fleet. This is a floating nation." Another nodded sharply. And today, that nation is heading to France. Meanwhile, in the American ranks, soldiers were focused, determined, silent. They didn't see the British generals watching them from the shore. They didn't hear the stunned whispers. They didn't know that their very presence was reshaping the hearts of men who had already survived Britain's darkest hours. All they knew was this. This was their moment. This was their reason for crossing the ocean. This was why they had trained, marched, sailed, bled, and waited. Somewhere among them, a young private whispered to his friend, "Do you think this will work?" His friend looked out at the endless rows of ships and said quietly, "After seeing all this? Yeah, I do." On the cliffs, General Dempsey lifted his binoculars again, scanning the fleet, studying the formations, the waves, the lines of ships stretching farther than any human eye could fully take in. Then he said something he had never said before in his entire military career. "This is beyond military planning. This is destiny." The officer beside him swallowed hard. "Sir, what do you think the Germans will say when they see this?" Dempsey lowered the binoculars, his expression grave. "They will know the war is ending." The sun rose higher. The American armada grew brighter. The British commanders stood quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. Some thought of the soldiers, some thought of the strategy, some thought of the cost, but all of them thought of one truth. Tomorrow, Europe would begin to breathe again. And as the fleet continued eastward, unstoppable, undeniable, General Montgomery spoke the words that every British general had felt, but none had yet said aloud. Today we witness the greatest force for liberation the world has ever assembled. And God willing, it will be enough. The night before the invasion fleet moved into its final positions, the British generals gathered. Once more in Southwick House, the great naval chart covered the entire wall, with every beach of Normandy drawn in careful detail. Eisenhower stood silently near the far end of the room, hands behind his back, head lowered as if thinking through every life, every landing craft, every storm cloud that might shift the course of history. Across from him, General Bernard Montgomery paced with restless energy, tugging at his battle jacket, rehearsing the flow of the invasion in his mind. The British officers around him, Miles Dempsey, Frederick Morgan, Trafford Lee-Mallory, watched him quietly, each one carrying the weight of responsibility for the thousands of men sleeping only miles away. But something was different today, something deep, something none of them had ever witnessed in their lives, not even in the darkest nights of the Blitz. For the first time, America's full power was visible, not in speeches or promises, but in steel, engines, and determination. And that power was about to merge with Britain's century-old grit. The first sight of destiny. By dawn, the British generals were escorted to a lookout point above Portsmouth. It was a strategic observation spot, high, windy, and nearly sacred now, because from this cliff, one could see almost everything that mattered. The mist was beginning to clear. The first outlines of ships emerged, and then the rest. A gasp broke the stillness. Someone whispered, "Good God in heaven." The sea was no longer a sea. It was America, an ocean turned into an army. Destroyers, battleships, troop transports stretching beyond the curve of the earth. LSTs in rows so perfectly aligned they looked like a steel highway. Landing crafts so numerous they created a moving, shifting carpet of metal. And behind them, carriers, command ships, supply vessels, hospital ships, everything. A modern war machine required for a battle that would decide the fate of millions. The British generals stood frozen, their hats pressed against the rising wind, their faces half-lit in the morning glow, their eyes wide with disbelief, respect, and something else, something deeper. Relief. For 5 long years, Britain had fought alone, bled alone, suffered alone. Tonight, for the first time, they saw that they would never be alone again. Montgomery speaks first. Montgomery slowly lowered his binoculars. His voice, usually sharp and clipped, softened. "Look at them," he said quietly. "Look at how they move. Every line, every formation. It's like watching a continent putting itself to sea." He stepped forward, boots crunching against gravel. "I have fought many battles," he added, "but I have never seen anything like this. Not even in dreams." Behind him, Dempsey murmured, "Sir, this is more than a fleet. This is civilization answering tyranny." Montgomery nodded. His face hardened, not with anger, but with purpose. "I knew the Americans were committed," he said. "But this is a promise. A promise to the world that freedom will not die on European soil." A British admiral wipes his eyes. Standing slightly apart from the group was Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the man who planned the naval assault. His usually stoic face betrayed him for a moment. He wiped the corner of his eye. No one mocked him. No one dared. He had seen Dunkirk. He had seen men rescued by civilian boats because the British military had nothing left to give. He had seen Britain pushed to the brink of collapse. And now he was seeing the opposite. The greatest maritime power in human history gathering under one banner. "It is," Ramsay whispered, voice cracking, "the largest armada the world has ever known. And every ship carries the same message: we stand with you." His words trembled in the air like rising smoke. The sound of America. Below the cliff, the deep thunder of engines rolled through the wind. It was not just noise. It was a heartbeat, a single, unified pulse of determination. The British generals felt it in their chests. "These ships were built in months," one admiral said, still astonished. "Months. No one else in the world can do that." Another added, This is America at full speed. When they commit with everything they are. Someone behind them muttered what every man was secretly thinking. With this fleet, Hitler doesn't stand a chance. What they said when they saw the troops aboard. The generals moved closer to the observation platform, where large viewfinders were mounted. Through the lenses, they could see the American soldiers clearly, thousands of them standing on decks, lined up shoulder to shoulder. Some were singing, some were writing letters, some were staring straight at the horizon they would soon storm. But all of them carried the same expression, a mixture of courage, fear, and determination. Montgomery spoke again, this time with pride in his tone. Look at their faces. They know what they're marching into, and they're not turning back. That kind of resolve wins wars. Ramsay nodded solemnly. They're young, he whispered. Too young for this, some of them. But by God, they came anyway. A general beside him added. They cross an ocean to fight for a land they've never seen, for people they've never met. That is not just bravery. That is humanity. Silence followed. The emotional kind. The kind that squeezes the heart. The moment they realized the scale. As more fog drifted away, the British officers saw something that made them all inhale sharply. Another full line of ships was emerging from the mist behind the first. And behind them, another. And another. It was endless. Rows upon rows upon rows. Montgomery whispered, "This is not a fleet. This is an avalanche." One of his staff officers murmured, "If you were a German lookout and saw this heading toward you, you'd know the war was over." An older general placed his hat against his chest. "I have waited for this day since 1940, he said quietly. "Since the darkest nights of the Blitz. And now I see our deliverance, carried by American steel." British soldiers reacting nearby, not far from the general's platform. British infantrymen, tired, hardened, weathered by years of war, were standing behind the railings. Their reactions were no less emotional. One young British corporal whispered, "Blimey, they came in force, didn't they?" His friend laughed softly, eyes still wide. "Force? That's not force. That's the whole United States Navy." Further down the line, a veteran sergeant murmured, "This is what hope looks like." But the most powerful moment came when a British private looked at the endless American ships and said with a trembling voice, "My brother died in France. I didn't think we'd ever get back there. But now I know we will." A major responded firmly, "We're going back. And this time, we're not retreating." The British generals meeting with Eisenhower again. Later that morning, the British generals returned to Southwick House to debrief Eisenhower. But something had changed in the room. Something subtle, but unmistakable. They no longer saw Eisenhower as the American commander leading his own men. They saw him as the commander of their men too. The man carrying the hopes of two nations. Montgomery spoke first. "Ike, I have seen the fleet. And I must tell you, I am humble." Eisenhower smiled faintly. "Well, Monty, I hope that means you approve." Montgomery exhaled slowly. "I approve, yes. But more than that, I believe. I believe this will work." Eisenhower nodded, relieved. Ramsay stepped forward. "General, Britain thanks you," he said quietly. "We have endured much. But today you gave this island something it has not felt in years." "What's that?" Eisenhower asked. Ramsay's eyes shined. "Certainty. The British home front reacts." By midday, word began to leak across southern England. People in Portsmouth, Southampton, and Plymouth climbed onto rooftops. Children pointed at the sky. Women held their breath. Old veterans pulled out binoculars they hadn't touched since the Great War. Everyone stared at the sea. Everyone saw the giant shadow America cast across the channel. And everywhere, the same whispers spread through the streets. They came. They really came. God bless America. Look at the size of it. This is it. This is the invasion. Some people cried openly. Others stood silent, absorbing the scale. But every British heart beat louder that day. A quote that defined the moment. One British general, an older man, who had served in Africa, France, and the Middle East, leaned against the railing and said something that would stay with everyone present. "I once feared the war would end with Britain standing alone on the ruins of Europe. But now I see the truth. The war will end with Britain walking into Europe hand in hand with America." Another general added quietly, "And Hitler will hear our footsteps long before he sees us." The room fell silent again. The emotional weight of what was coming. As evening approached, the sky turned orange. and the fleet glowed like a burning horizon. The British generals did not move. They simply watched the sun fall behind the silhouettes of thousands of American ships. Montgomery whispered, "These young men, thousands of them, will risk everything in a few hours. Some will not return, but they go willingly for a world they dream of." Dempsey exhaled shakily. "I hope the world remembers them." Ramsay nodded. "It will," he said, "because what we're witnessing today is not just the might of a nation. It's the courage of free men." The final words before nightfall. The last thing spoken before the generals left the cliffside came from an older British admiral, his voice deep, steady, and heavy with emotion. "When future generations ask how tyranny was defeated, someone must say, because America sailed across the ocean and stood beside us." He placed his hat back on his head. "And tonight, I believe, with every part of my soul, that we will win." The wind blew hard. Sea spray hit their coats. Engines roared across the channel. And yet, in that moment, the British generals felt something they hadn't felt since the war began. Peace. Because now they knew. The fight for freedom had become unstoppable. The night deepened across the English Channel. Lamps on the great American Armada glowed softly in the darkness. A constellation of steel guiding thousands of souls toward one shared tomorrow. On the cliffs overlooking the fleet, British generals stood once more, not with maps now, not with strategy laid bare, but in silence, each feeling the weight of what awaited them at dawn. The sea was alive with expectant energy, engines idling, men preparing, waves lapping against hulls like nature's own heartbeat. In that hush before war, there was also a breath of something else, resolve. General Montgomery stood near the rail, hands clasped behind his back. He closed his eyes for a moment, as though committing the image to memory forever. The endless lines of ships, the dim glow of lamps across dark water, the hush of night heavy with fate. He whispered softly, "We've done all we can. Come morning, the rest belongs to them and to history." Nearby, Admiral Ramsay, master of the sea lanes and naval strategy, looked over a naval map but did not speak. The lines and coordinates were meaningless now. What mattered was what lay beyond them. Thousands of men willing to storm the beaches for freedom. He simply nodded once, quietly, a gesture that carried more significance than any speech. The last hours of waiting. On the beaches and on the decks of landing craft, soldiers prepared silently. On one transport ship, British and American officers passed through corridors, offering quick nods, a whispered "good luck," a firm clasp of the shoulder. They understood each other not because they had shared a lifetime, but because they shared this moment. A young British lieutenant looked at the American troops beside him. He saw fear, yes, but also something stronger, fierce determination. He thought of his own family, of a mother praying at home, of a sister writing letters, of all the lives torn apart by war. He swallowed hard and said quietly, "Tomorrow, we go not just for victory. We go for them." An American private, loading his equipment with trembling hands, looked at the lieutenant and replied, "Then let's give them a future worth fighting for." A silence passed between them, heavy, sacred, resolute. Dawn breaks. As the first light of dawn crept across the water, the fleet began its slow, solemn movement toward Normandy's shores. Hulls creaked, chains rattled, engines hummed in unison. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath. On the cliffs, the British generals watched, silent but steady. The wind whipped salt against their faces. The cold cut through their coats. Yet none flinched. None turned away. Churchill was not physically there, but in spirit, in every heart present. The sacrifices of London, of bombed-out homes and broken families, of nights spent in shelters, all of them led to this moment. And this moment was not for vengeance. It was for liberation. Montgomery finally spoke, not to men, but to fate. Let history record this morning, not as the cost of war, but as the price of freedom. An admiral beside him quietly added, "And may those who pay it not be forgotten." Crossing the channel, the quiet fear. As the landing craft approached the beaches, crews checked weapons, tightened harnesses, held rifles like fragile promises. Some men prayed softly under their breath. Others stared at the horizon, eyes fixed, jaw set. Death was not a word they said aloud, but every man knew it hovered just beyond the crest of the waves. And yet they went anyway, because some things are worth more than fear, because hope demanded a cost. Because freedom demanded sacrifice. What the British generals felt in the silence before battle. In a command tent near the coast, General Dempsey sat alone, writing in a small notebook, not orders, not logistics, but a few lines he would carry in his heart forever. He wrote, "If the world is about to change, let it remember that this was not the end of tyranny, but the beginning of hope, not just for Britain, but for all Europe." Outside, Churchill's portrait hung on a wall battered by war, its glass cracked, frame chipped, but still watchful. Dempsey stared at it for a moment. He thought of letters from families, messages from the front, quiet prayers whispered in churches and bunkers alike. He thought of those who would not return. Then he folded the paper, sealed it away, stood, and walked to the cliff windows, looking out at the endless line of vessels, toward a horizon shaped not by sorrow, but by resolve. He whispered softly, "May history forgive us our bloodshed, and bless those who saved us." The final orders, a shift from waiting to action. Inside the operations center, radios crackled. Morse code tapped. Officers checked coordinates, tide times, moonlight angles, beach designations. Then, the moment. A calm, authoritative voice spoke over the radio. "All units, proceed to channel A6. Land at H hour +1. Wind calm. Tide favorable." A muted breath rose across the room. Maps were folded. Chairs scraped on the floor. Men rose. A single murmur echoed. "Let's go." At that word, something shifted. Not just strategy, not just plans, but fear changed into determination, doubt into action, chaos into purpose. What British generals knew, and what they feared. They knew this invasion would not be clean. They knew it would cost lives. They knew many would die. They knew families across Britain, America, and Europe would weep. But they also knew something else. They knew that freedom was not negotiable. They knew tyranny thrived on silence. They knew that the longer they waited, the higher the cost. And so they sent men forward. Men not built for killing, but for saving. Men not motivated by hatred, but by hope. The silent promise, from Britain to America, from generals to soldiers. As the waves rocked landing craft, and as dawn cracked across the channel, the British generals stood in their command posts, watching the beginning of a dream take form. Montgomery whispered, eyes fixed on the radio updates. "Go well, lads. Bring them home." Ramsay stood at the map table, hand on the rail, silent, as if in prayer. Dempsey watched the sea, waiting for a signal. And somewhere, in the hearts of every general, sprang the same wish. That this war would end not just with defeat of an enemy, but with the restoration of humanity. After the first wave, the quiet after the roar. As shells fired and the first landings began, the British command center fell into a heavy hush. Reports came in, delayed, fragmented, painful, but mixed among them, determination, progress, survivors reaching safety, small breakthroughs, courage shining through chaos. One young report caught a general's eye. An American lieutenant had led men up a cliff under fire. He had paused, looked back to the sea, and shouted over the roar, "For every child we lost, we reclaim a home." The general closed his eyes and exhaled. He knew that phrase would echo longer than any bullet. When dawn gave way to action, the sea turned silver under the rising sun. Ships unloaded, landing craft grounded. Men stormed beaches. Allies advanced. Explosions shook the sand and stone. Chaos reigned. But through the chaos emerged something else. Unity, resolve, humanity. In the war rooms, the British generals listened to reports. Some were tragic, some hopeful, some heroic. One general turned to another and said quietly, "War shows the worst of humanity, and sometimes also the best." Another added, "Today, what we see is not the end of a fight, but the beginning of a new world." What they said when it was over, for now. As the first light of legitimate victory dawned, the landing turned successful, the beach secured, reinforcements arriving, the British senior commanders gathered once more near the shore. Montgomery looked at the survivors, British, American, Allied, stained, battered, but alive. He saw children peeking from behind ruined walls, civilians looking on with tearful awe, flags rising over liberated towns. He closed his eyes. He whispered, "This was never just a battle." He paused, then spoke to the wind. "This was redemption." Admiral Ramsay lowered his hat, removed his gloves. and spoke in a dry but steady voice. For those who fell, we will remember. For those who live, we will rebuild. For Europe, we will restore. General Dempsey placed a hand on a young soldier's shoulder, an American private who had just emerged from the smoke. The private's uniform was torn, face dirted, yet his eyes burned with life. Dempsey nodded to him, not as a commander to a subordinate, but as a man acknowledging another man's sacrifice. He said simply, "Welcome home." Epilogue: the promise of tomorrow. War would continue for months. Europe's soil would run red again. Cities would crumble. People would suffer. Families would cry. But on this day, when British generals saw America's invasion fleet and realized the tide had turned, something irrevocable began. A coalition of hope, a unity of nations, a promise that tyranny could be challenged. As the fleet returned to its base, as soldiers regrouped, as orders spread across radio static and paper, one truth took root in every command post, every makeshift bunker, every heart. Evil can be stopped when the free stand together. Years later, historians would write of battles, strategies, losses, and triumphs. But among the speeches, the dates, the names, there would always be one moment remembered not for blood, but for hope. That moment when British and American blood mingled and shared purpose. That moment when thousands of ships across the sea became a single force of liberation. That moment when generals saw more than an army, they saw possibility. And because they saw it, they dared to act. They dared to believe. They dared to hope. And on that hope, the world's future slowly began to turn.